Hi, everyone. Attendees, welcome. This is the first event of UAA's annual Democracy and Civic Action Week. This is our fourth iteration of this event. My name is Marsha Olson. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Community Engagement and Learning at UAA and a faculty member at UAA as well. I'm one of the chairs of the Planning Committee for this week of events. And my job is just to introduce our host for the night, and he can talk a bit more about the panel, and we'll get started. Before we go any further, I did want to add a brief acknowledgement. So UAA, and I believe all of us here are located here in Anchorage right now. We are situated on the lands of the traditional Den'ina Athabascan people. We like to acknowledge that we live and work and play on their lands and thank them for their stewardship of the land in the past, the present, and into the future. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ian Hartman, one of our faculty members in the Department of History, and let him take it away with this great panel. I'm so excited.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Marsha. I'll just begin by thanking everyone. And I, of course, would specifically like to thank Donna again and Marsha Olson for putting this discussion together. And I, too, wish to acknowledge the Dena'ina people on whose land I will be moderating this discussion this evening. And, of course, I'd like to thank the discussants for participating, each one of whom I will introduce briefly in just a minute. So what I think we would do is just run through a few questions that I have, and then we can open up this panel to other questions if folks have some, or we can just have a more kind of free-flowing discussion beyond maybe the 30 to 45 minute mark. But again, before doing so, we have three terrific panelists who each have their own kind of angle and niche expertise with which they plan to weigh in this topic. And again, for those of you tuning in, this is we're calling this Centering the Community, a discussion on public history and civic engagement. So that's the intersection with Democracy and Civic Action Week. And we've got first on the panel, Aaron Leggett, who was born in Anchorage and is Dena'ina Athabascan. He is a senior curator of Alaska history and indigenous culture at the Anchorage Museum and has worked for the Anchorage Historic Preservation Commission as the Dena'ina cultural historian and assistant curator of collections and exhibits at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. Mr. Leggett is also president and chair of the Tribal Council of the Native Village of Eklutna. He's served as a conservation advisor for the Sharing Our Knowledge project, as well as an exhibition advisor for the Living Our Cultures exhibit. Aaron has co-edited an impressive collection of essays, Dena'ina Huch the Dena'ina Way of Living, and has been instrumental to the museum as a historian and anthropologist. And just a little bit beyond that, Aaron has graciously agreed to do a couple of these panels with me, and I'm always grateful that he has agreed to do so. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us. We've got Julie Vree, who has lived in Anchorage since 1988 and has more recently served as the Anchorage Museum's community outreach archivist. Vree works with individuals and organizations to help the museum tell stories of value to community through archival collections. A 35-plus year professional in the field of philanthropy and development, Vree returned to school in 2018 to earn a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Washington. She was part of the museum and community member team that developed the Black Lives in Alaska, A Journey, Justice, and Joy exhibition, which I can assure everybody is an awesome exhibit at the museum, and I hope everyone has a chance to see it, and is involved in ensuring that the museum's Atwood Resource Center is a space that's welcoming to all. And Julie and I have worked together on the exhibit and in other capacities, and I'm very honored that Julie's able to join us as well. So thank you, Julie. And last but certainly not least, we've got David Reamer, who is an academic and public historian with an emphasis on Alaska and especially Anchorage history, with a broader interest in the intersections of history, practice, and community development. He writes a weekly history column for the Anchorage Daily News. I'm sure many of you have read it, coming at angles of everything from tidbits of Anchorage history to kind of hard-hitting pieces that talk about pressing social issues David is certainly one of the best historians working today on Alaska history and Anchorage history. He posts daily Alaska history on Twitter. I don't have a Twitter account, so let me make sure I get this right. At capital A, capital N, capital C, at @Ank_historian. And David and I have also collaborated on some projects, and I have benefited greatly from David's insights and research over the years. And I'm very proud that he's with us today. And I just want to reiterate that we have a great panelists who are going to discuss public history. And again, David coming at this as kind of a public historian in the public square, writing for the ADN, among his other pursuits, Julie Vree as a community outreach archivist, and Aaron Leggett in his capacity as curator at the Anchorage Museum. So with all of that said, the first question I guess I will throw out to our panelists is one that kind of gets us to talk from maybe the 40,000-foot view here. This is a panel that is entitled Centering the Community, a discussion on public history and civic engagement. And as such, I'd love to hear how each of you, a community outreach archivist, a museum curator, and a public historian, conceive of community engagement and how you connect the respective careers you've all gone into with the broader mission that is rooted to our community here in Anchorage and perhaps even Alaska more broadly. I'm not in the business of picking on people, so whoever wants to go first, feel free.
All right, I'll go first. So in my work as a Dena'ina cultural historian and working at the Alaska Native Heritage Center and the Anchorage Museum, to me, it seemed vital from the very beginning of my career to work with the public. And a lot of my work actually doesn't center in the museum itself. It actually is centered in the community, and doing projects like interpretive panels, naming of the Dena'ina Center, the interpretive art in there, talking on these kinds of panels, talking in schools. I really see my role as being out in the community and also getting feedback from the community as well. And when we do exhibitions at the museum involving, like when we did the Dena'ina exhibit, having a Dena'ina advisory committee was very important to us from the get-go. And that's the way I've always approached my work, is to kind of knock down those sort of powers, so to speak. And it's just the way I've always approached my work, I guess.
I'll go next. So archives are really a form of storytelling about, people and places or a specific event. And the museum realizes that the story it's trying to tell through the archives that it manages have gaps. So there are voices missing from community members and groups in the community that are especially people from historically marginalized communities. And so it's impossible to tell those stories without engaging those people because the stories are theirs to tell. So like Aaron, a lot of my work isn't truly centered in the museum, though more than I thought it would be because of COVID. But a lot of it is about making sure the archives follow the model that the museum has come to with its exhibitions and other programs, and that there are multiple perspectives represented in any story that we tell. And so where traditionally a lot of archives are from a single perspective, and that's probably the settler perspective. And so my job with outreach is to invite people to share their lives and experiences through the archives. And I think it's been interesting how that has come about, because it really has been more of a supportive position. What can we offer as the museum? Well, we have the technology and the way to promote programs. So if there's a topic you want to discuss from the perspective of your community, we can host that for you. When we can do this again, we have this beautiful space. We have these beautiful spaces. We can host you to do a community event, to do a cultural event. And it's been kind of amazing to still be able to do that during the pandemic with online programs like this, and also the use of our outside space. So that's the work of the outreach archivist at the museum.
Thanks, Julie.
So for me, community engagement as a historian is a twofold process for those historians that do community engagement. First, there's the matter of making history available in a public way, in the way the public will actually consume it. I love my journal articles. I love university press published monographs as much as any other proper historian. But the big flaw with that method of history dissemination is that it's locked away. It's typically expensive, especially to access a random journal article. If you're not already in academia, have access through universities, you're just frankly not going to come across that knowledge. And too often it's also written in accessible language. So you end up with this circle of historians reading historians, publishing thoughts about those previous historians in this awful, boring, very closed circle. So for some of the things I've done, like writing a newspaper or public talks or posting on Nextdoor of all places, or posting history on Twitter, is I'm trying to find the audience for history where it actually is, rather than waiting for them to track down me or any other historian. And second, there's the matter of topic selection, which I heard Julie mention. Being truly engaged as a historian with the community means being open to the topics being determined by someone other than yourself. That's one of the joys of being an academic historian, is you can follow whatever minute little topic that interests you to insane depths. And that's fine, that's understandable. You can make an argument for it, you can publish it, you can profit. But that doesn't mean it's history that anyone else will care about. So finding history that other people want to hear. This isn't absolute, of course. If it was, then certain aspects of hidden history, certain little dark corners of history would never emerge because they wouldn't know to ask for it. But there are history pieces I've written or details I've tweeted about solely because there was an expressed interest, an appetite for it. So it's why I advocated for having a feedback function in my articles. And it's why I spend on average about a day a week just one-on-one answering history questions from the public, just granular community engagement.
David, that's really wonderfully stated, and I only feel a little bit called out, right? I mean, as somebody who has spent most of my life in, traditional academic circles, I think you have diagnosed extraordinarily well something that I certainly am guilty of myself. And one that I'm aware of. And it's also something that I think, thanks to the work that I've done with you, and thanks to the work I've done with Julie, I've come a little bit out of that mold in some ways. But I think that too often academic, not just academic history, but academics more generally, I think it does tend to be very insulated. And that I think is a topic that we can explore a little bit more deeply over the next couple of questions as well. So I appreciate the points that all of you've made. And I'm hoping that, thanks to this venue and more generally just the Center for Community Engagement Learning, I mean, really the attempt that is being made at UAA and in these forums is to try to kind of get out of that bubble. And to the extent that, we're successful, it's very much so thanks to forums such as these. So my second question, and I'll apologize up front, because one of the things I think you'll probably notice is that these questions are going to kind of rhyme with each other. So a lot of the points that you've maybe have made already or will make will kind of resurface in subsequent questions. But this second one is, again, kind of in the spirit of democracy and civic engagement. And so one of the things as I was putting together this panel that I certainly noticed about the three of you is that you have what I would consider to be public facing positions, whereby you do engage regularly with people outside of your profession. And David, just to pick on you, you just pointed out, you've got the feature in your column where people can actually, kind of get in touch with you directly. I mean, that's a very clear example of that. But Julie and Aaron also have, I think, a similar public facing position. And so could you relate how your work then expresses a democratic ideal, one that emphasizes the centrality of kind of regular people, just more generally, not the rich and the powerful, right? How have you worked to include a diversity of voices, be they in historical narratives you write, the archival records you process, or the museum collections you curate? And if I can just say as an addendum to that question, one of the reasons why I was keenly interested in having each one of you on this panel is because each of you do that very well. The topic of all of your work, as I understand it, is almost never the rich and the powerful. And so if you could just kind of talk a little bit about the selection of your topics, how you kind of link that to maybe a broader philosophy of democracy, I would really appreciate it. And I'm sure the others on this call would too.
Well, I mean, for me, having grown up in Alaska, having been educated at UAA in both the history, but more so in the anthropology department, and having had opportunities to actually work on public facing history early in my career with Steve Haycox and AJ McClanahan when they used to do a history scrapbook piece every week. Usually my job was to track down the photographs and in the various archives. So that's where I first got kind of introduced to that. But I think for me, what I started to discover in high school early on, but more so in college, was how little most citizens of Anchorage understand the history of this place. Certainly not just from a Dena'ina perspective, which was, I make a very strong case, virtually absent completely, but the history of, how do we have these names for places, roads that go in? We have very much a transient population. That's starting to shift in the last 15, 20 years, but generally speaking, it's been pretty, the history that's been told has been pretty, well, I'm just going to come out and say it. It's been pretty much shaped by 3 or 4 individuals predominantly. And it has huge gaps that are left there. And one of the most inspiring moments of my life was in high school. I had an opportunity to go to an assembly with the late George Harper, whose project Blacks in Alaska was a huge inspiration for me, although I didn't know it at the time. And I remember he showed this one photograph. I think it was taken in Skagway or somewhere in Southeast, and it was this Arctic Brotherhood gathering, all these sourdough gold miners, and they're all standing out in front, and they're all wearing their various fraternal regalia. But way up in the corner of this building, up in the window, was the African-American cook or employee for the company. And he said, when most people see this photo, what they look at is who are all the white pioneers, the ones that went over the Chilkoot Pass and all these things. He said, for me, when I look at that photo, I want to look up in the window and I want to know that guy's story. And that's really fundamentally the approach that I take, is sometimes what's not being captured in the image tells more than what actually is being captured. And so I like to pick out those little nuggets and find those bits of history and remind people that, Anchorage as a city is just barely past its, 100th anniversary. The Anchorage Police Department just celebrated its 100th anniversary with its first, and I had the opportunity to do say a few words for the swearing in of the first African-American police chief. And so this is not distant history. This is very recent history. And I think, but it's largely an untold history. And so I'm very interested in trying to engage with people in the community and realized that it doesn't go really that far back. And so, but it's been largely ignored. And so to sort of come back to democratize that, it's how can you shine a light on not the history that we think we know, but what is the history that's more inclusive. I mean, there's no such thing as one true history. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but more of a inclusive history or multiple perspectives of what we tend to celebrate.
I want to follow up on that because I was thinking about how I worked for the Catholic Church in Alaska for 8.5 years. And toward the end of that, I remember being in this workshop, and it was with people from the church, but these were donors. So these were wealthy people in the church, kind of homogenous group. And one of the breakout rooms I was in, the discussion was on the evolution of the traditions in the church. And this snowballed into, oh, and of course, I'm the only person of color in the room, which is always delightful. And so this conversation snowballs into how much better everything was in the 40s and 50s, not just in the church, but in the United States. And so I listened to this, and finally I said, you know, it was not better for my community. It wasn't good for my community. It wasn't good for my grandparents who couldn't vote. They couldn't live where they wanted to live. They couldn't work where they wanted to work. My mother, you know, I mean, that's pretty recent. My mother couldn't vote when she became a voting age. And what struck me about that interaction was these people were totally shocked by this. It had never entered their mind that this period in history was different for someone else. I mean, it was just silent for a minute in the room. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this is what, I mean, it was just shocking to me that this was some new thought. And that's when I thought that, you know, we can't have democracy if we're not willing to be honest about whose voice and perspective is missing, and the fact that some of us have benefited from how things were in this period of time, including now that we are some of us are so nostalgic about. So I think, you know, when you're thinking about public history and trying to ensure that other voices are there, it's to everyone's benefit that there are multiple perspectives represented, because I don't think we can grow as a community and as a nation without that realization and being honest about where we are.
It's a powerful anecdote, Julie. Thank you for sharing.
For me, it's partly comes down to just my personal inclination. I just talked highly of taking leads from the public history topics, but the one where I've disappointed maybe the people the most has been politics. I've had no great interest in delving into, you know, the political goings on, the scandals of 1965 politics. You know, those who had the most massive political or economic sway. I've always been more interested in the mundane aspects of life in Alaska. And, you know, how fast could I drive in a car in 1922? Speed limits. What was it like going to the post office? You know, the burdens and handicaps of life, the discrimination, union battles, commodity shortages, housing shortages. Things that to me speak to a broader quality of what life was like back then than talking about legislation necessarily. Titans of industry, such as they were in Alaska. As regards diversity, more specifically in my work, it's very much a work in progress. And it's also very much a conscious act. I explicitly remind myself from time to time, to be very honest with you, I tell myself, I haven't written about women in a while. Let's write about women. I remind myself to tweet about Alaska Natives, to bring out documentation of other diverse people who have lived and worked in Alaska, from Filipino cannery workers to Sudanese refugees now, or Hmong refugees I meet in Russian Jack, Chinese expulsion from Juneau in the 19th century. And in a way, as a historical practice, highlighting diversity in this way almost has to be an effort for me, because the documentation is never as easily found. It's never going to be, the most well written about. I'm never going to find the great, easy secondary sources. It's always going to be a hard dig. They're never going to be as plentiful as they would be for, Ernest Greening or someone like that.
Hey, thanks, David. I'm looking over my questions, and as anyone who's ever been on a panel with me moderating probably knows by now, I tend to over prepare with too many questions, and I see it's almost now 6:30, and I am hoping that we can open it up to some discussion, or we can just have a more free-flowing conversation beyond the questions that I've prepared. But I do have at least one or two more that I could ask. And David, I'm thinking, just what you kind of mentioned there, the hard work of research, to me is what I took out of that last comment that you mentioned. I mean, uncovering a lot of these stories that are maybe deeper in the archives, stories that might not necessarily fall on the front page of the newspaper, stories that aren't necessarily about, as you put it, the comings and goings of the major political figures of the day. And so I guess then the question that I have as a follow-up to that is, what do you find to be the most rewarding aspect of your profession? And then kind of on top of that, what makes it challenging? And maybe the most rewarding part is, in fact, the research. On the other hand, maybe that's the most challenging. And so I'd love to hear how each of you find your profession really rewarding and or challenging, I guess, depending on the particular pursuit that you're involved in at the moment.
Well, I think for me, the most rewarding part of, well, there's twofold. The sort of personally, the most rewarding thing is actually getting into an archive and really digging in and finding that historic photo that nobody knew existed, or I'm able to identify or connect up with some major event or person or whatever it is. Just the hunt of that personally is the most satisfying. But kind of professionally, I would say for me, the most rewarding is when there's some sort of major event and there's a massive turnout with a wide cross section of Anchorage. A good example of that was a little over a month ago with the unveiling of one of the Dena'ina interpretive sign, or Dena'ina Indigenous place name signs down at Westchester Lagoon, and we were quite fortunate to have it well documented in the media, and it actually got picked up as a national story. So that to me is really professionally rewarding, because for the work that I do, it's not about me as the individual. It's really about getting that information out to as wide and broad of an audiences as possible. The most challenging part of my work, never enough time, never enough resources, just the kind of the standard sorts of things. I know it's kind of boring, but there's so much. There's only so much one can do, and so you just I think also people. I guess what's disappointing sometimes is I don't think people understand that how long it can take for change to actually occur and to affect. A good example of that was last year. There was calls to take down the Captain Cook Memorial, and despite my best efforts, I got into the middle of it, and I was getting attacked really from both sides because they were not happy with what I thought was a well-measured and well thought out argument to how to address this issue. There's this instinct to either, rip it down, tear it down, discard it, make it, in the dustbin of history, so to speak, which I don't think is usually the right case. There's a few pretty blatant examples. And I know Ian and I, we've talked about this quite a bit, but at the same time, I think that taking something like that and spinning it back around to create a more positive experience for people, I think is seizing on those opportunities.
I think for me, well, first I'll say this is, I think, the most rewarding work I've ever done. And I think a big part of that is just helping to ensure that people feel like they're part of an institution that I have always loved, and that they know they can see themselves there, they can engage with it in many ways, and that they're being heard with ideas and what they'd like to see happening there. And you know, it's very rewarding to hand over the keys to someone, you know, for someone to say, you know, for example, connected with the Black Lives in Alaska exhibition, to say, you know, what kind of programs should we be doing, you know, while this exhibition is up? And to hear ideas, but also to be able to say, well, can your organization take that? Like, can you take it over? Can you get the speakers? Can you find a moderator? You know more about this topic than I do. And you've got connections in the community, which is great because it broadens my connections for other things, for other work later. And so it's very rewarding to make it possible for people to make something happen that really matters to them. Something else that happened that I have really found rewarding is we did a program with members of the refugee and immigrant community. And that was one where Issa Spatrasano at Ray's helped me put together a group of people that are doing this work with those communities. And so they identified the topics that would be interesting to them. And the first one was education. And so the panel came together, and this amazing woman named Nayaboni Gat was chosen to be the moderator of the panel. You know, Nayaboni, she's great. And so because of that, we were all blown away, even the people on the panel who knew her, at how masterful she was at being the moderator. And so I was so happy to tell her, hey, now you have done it and you're in the pool of moderators that I hope I can call on for other things. And this does not have to be related to the refugee and immigrant communities. And so now she's about to moderate a panel later this month about being biracial in Alaska. So I think that's the really rewarding thing. And the challenging thing for me has just been navigating the work during the pandemic, but we've all had to do that, and we've all found ways to do that.
For me, like Erin, I can split it into the personal and the professional. Personally, it's always been very rewarding to write about something that has received no historical touch, no write-ups since it happened. From the mundane, like chinchilla farming in Anchorage. No one's paid attention to that since it happened and has forgotten about it since. To, I had a thread on Twitter about a teacher the school district tried to fire in '77 for being a lesbian. I had a thread about it with all the details and the back and forth, the suspensions, the attempts to fire, her eventually moving away. But that's out there now in a public way. And you can't get that information anywhere else unless you dive back into the coverage of the day. No one's written about that since. No one's touched on that really. In the personal way, it's, again, it's the one-on-one comments I've gotten. And the best one is always close to my heart. I've written about the namesake of the Glen Highway, who, in short, he committed several atrocities during the Philippine-American War. He tortured people, he burned down innocent villages, he killed prisoners. And which this is actually another example of how history can stay locked away, because the exploits of his military career were well known among historians, well documented. I think it's fair to say almost no one in Alaska knew about it. But after I wrote the article about Glenn, I got a response on Twitter. Young lady told me that she had grown up in Anchorage in the Filipino community. She had no idea that this, touchstone that connected Anchorage to colonialism, to the brutal wars, and to literal war crimes. Glenn was convicted. He was convicted of a war crime. She had no idea that her home was connected, that her homes were connected in this way. And she told me that she had no idea until the post, until I wrote about it. And that she then sat down with her dad, who was military, and had a talk about what military leadership was, about the history of Filipinos in Alaska. And that was the greatest compliment I could ever get. It prompted conversation. It hit them in a very real way. And it was spreading organically. And that's all I can ever hope for and all I ever really want.
A powerful point, David. Thank you. As a follow-up to that, I think all three of you made some type of comment, again, about community engagement and how you've interacted with folks. And Aaron, you mentioned one of the points that just sticks out in my mind is that you were kind of getting it from both sides on the Cook monument for, just as one example of this. I think maybe my final question before we'll open things up, and I have plenty of other ones if we decide for me to keep asking, but how are you, the three of you, I guess, negotiating what we might call like a fraught political landscape right now? That sometimes you'll hear reference to the history wars, and these seem to flare up it seems like every 15 or 20 years, there's a new debate about history or the teaching of history in schools or the way that history is presented. And it just occurs to me that the three of you are on the front lines of this most recent flare up in your own ways. And I'm curious how you have interacted with the public, or maybe you haven't. And, David, you've just provided one example, but maybe Aaron and Julie, if you could weigh in on that, how are you locating yourselves right now in this broader discussion of history in the public sphere?
Well, I think, what strikes me is like what David talked about. Often my work is to put the information out there and hope that it reaches the widest audience. And, the more history, the more we understand our place, the better, to create these dialogues. And I think it's really hard to have these conversations if you're not starting at a common base level. That doesn't mean there can't be differences. We could sit and debate Cook for hours, or Glenn for that matter, is another example, and what merits commemoration and all these things. And does one's actions at one point in their life negate actions at another point, and what's the level? And we're still kind of dancing around that, and everybody has, there's all sorts of skeletons in a lot of people's closets. That's sort of the narrative that we built our nation on. But the important thing is to get the information out there. And I think, like what David said, when conversations can be had around these sorts of topics organically and can be developed, and there's a level of nuance, I think that's when true discussions can happen. I mean, there are some things that we in Alaska just take for granted, as there are these historical blips, but that become quickly ingrained into our society or our state. A good example of that was a few years ago when somebody actually dug in and said, who is Wade Hampton, and what does it have to do with the census district out in in the YK Delta? And when they dug into it, because nobody from the region actually knew what it was. They just assumed, oh, it must have been some guy, or it was some guy. But when they dug into the story, they realized that it had zero connection to Alaska, that it was just a political favor, and that it really didn't represent our state in any way, shape, or form. And so it's quickly replaced. When you get into something like Glen Allen, Glen Highway, and all those, it becomes a little more difficult. So, but it's important to have those discussions. And I think what's interesting is that we're now starting to endeavor to do that.
I think to be part of organizations that have a really clear mission and have made a commitment to how information is going to be presented, and a commitment to engaging community and knowing the community. I think back to two examples come to mind. One is the Captain Cook exhibition that we had. And it's probably longer ago than I would believe, Aaron, maybe 5 years ago.
6, you're close. It was 2015. It was actually the same year as the centennial. So
wow. So I remember.
Well, we lost a year or two because of COVID. So
yeah, that's right. But I remember thinking, yeah, come to the museum and we'll tell you all about the voyages of Captain Cook, but you're also going to hear how that impacted Indigenous people. So come and see a map of an Anchorage neighborhood, but we're also going to tell you about redlining and how people weren't allowed to live there in Anchorage. So I think, it's the commitment and mission of an organization. And, this hits on other questions you sent us, Ian, about library professionals and how it used to be neutrality was this thing. So you were just kind of a pass through of information and you weren't really expected to provide context for information. And I think in my field, that is not what people expect to do or are committed to do. So I think on an organizational level and on a professional level, having a mission and making a commitment to the information being presented in ways that don't just keep feeding old ideas or limited ideas.
I liked what you said about come for the cook, but learn about some other real history. You didn't say real, but because I've often thought of that in my work, that I earn chances to have an audience, build an audience maybe, and then slip in something more that to them is going to be controversial. So I think of it as earning cred or earning auctoritas. Like I'll write about homesteaders, and then I'll write about the racial angle of the 64 Quit. In a couple weeks, I'm writing about the artist Sidney Lawrence. But then after that, I'm going to hit them with the Chinese expulsion from Juneau. I do the same thing on Twitter. I'm building audience following, whatever. Here's some history of some bars. Here's some history of dogs. People love when I tweet about dogs. It's my biggest tweets by far have all been about dogs. But here's ones about horrible acts of discrimination that you're not going to get anywhere else. And try and build some faith that I'm presenting some history accurately. It's also why my newspaper articles are those very rare newspaper articles with a bibliography. And again, just trying to sneak in, pushing them bits and bits at time. And they're not all going to accept it. People have loved me and then suddenly hated what I did because I touched on race. I always get very nasty emails about why did I write about race when I write about race, that I never get when I write about something that is truly silly, like chinchillas or wrestling. I never received a single complaint for those articles about why I spent my time and made them read about those topics. So earning a way in is my general takeaway there.
Very, very helpful and dare I say a bit stealthy of you, David, to kind of to make sure that people are getting the full details and the full spectrum of history amid the chinchillas and the wrestling and the concerts, the best concerts that have come through Anchorage. So I appreciate that. I have a quarter till 7, and so I think now would be a good time to open it up. I've posed a few questions. I'm happy to pose a few more, but maybe other folks have questions that are far more effectively conceived and articulated than mine. And if so, I'm sure our panelists would love to hear them. Can do a going once, a going twice, a going 3 times. No? All right. Well, I'll pose, and unless I see something that comes up in the chat, maybe this can be our send off. And then of course, like I said, I'll I want to respect everybody's time. But if someone does have a question that they'd like to pose to one of the panelists or all of the panelists, go ahead and include it in the chat. And then if not, I'll pose what will be my final question and maybe the final question of the evening. And this one's a little bit lighter, or it can be if you'd prefer it to. But given the richness of the respective topics that the 3 of you have worked on over the last several years, or you could go back a little bit further or more recently, I'd love to hear a project that you have found most rewarding. Is there a particular article, a particular collection, a particular museum exhibit that you have found to really encapsulate the spirit of civic engagement or just general effectiveness in conveying your passion for public history, maybe above and beyond some of the other things that you've done?
Yeah, that's tough. Probably the one that I think about was, and I think partially being a product of it and being surrounded by it, but how Alaska Native people, and by extension, Indigenous people, have been portrayed in mass media. We did an exhibit on, ostensibly it was supposed to be about Molly of Denali, but what I wanted to show with Molly of Denali was what a truly groundbreaking television program this was. And I would argue that when we talk about accessibility and barrier to entry, it's about the lowest barrier that has ever been put forth for representation of Indigenous people. If you have a TV that has an antenna and you can get a PBS station, you can see Molly of Denali. I mean, and it's free, So, but then looking at the history of the 20th century of how Indigenous people have been portrayed and how much of that has kind of shaped our ideas of the North. And I mean, we all know all the stereotypes: the dog sleds, the smiling Eskimos, the polar bears, the penguins, the igloos, all those things. But looking at how much it permeates our culture and how kind of in a way damaging it is. But there's been a real change and resurgence. It's not directly related to Alaska Natives, but certainly to Indigenous people. I'm really enjoying every week on FX on Hulu seeing the new Reservation Dogs television series that really looks at Indigenous humor, which is a pretty poorly explored topic out there. And so I guess that one is one that just jumps out to me.
Reservation Dogs is really well done. I've been impressed in the episodes I've seen thus far, and Molly Denali, of course, likewise. Thanks, Aaron.
I think for me, the Black Lives in Alaska exhibition, which is the first exhibition I got to work on, you don't get to do that in the fundraising department. So it was just a thrill for me to work with other teams in the museum that I had only, worked with peripherally before. Like maybe they gave a tour for a donor with me, but I didn't get to really work with them on a project. And I think what's been great is what's come out of that. and other outreach work, where people will say now, we have this cultural celebration. We got to bring part of that to the museum. Or, I do this big thing every June, and we used to do it on the park strip, but my community would like to have some part of it in your building or out on the lawn, or, so I really love that people are thinking more of the museum as a place where they belong and where their cultural celebrations belong, and, where they're treasured, photographs and films, and that this is a good place for that to be preserved and shared and made more accessible to a wider audience. And so I think for me, that's been just really wonderful over a short period of time to see that starting to happen even more.
So this isn't so much me as very likely following from the museum's current exhibit, but it's something that happened today. It's very much on my mind. I was talking to someone who's too young to have known the person personally, but they were looking at a picture and they went, "That's Blanche McSmith," the Black former representative, leader, newspaper writer, many, many things. And I thought to myself, 5 years ago, when Dr. Hartman and I were researching McSmith, she almost felt like a secret. Like, I'm sure, several handfuls of people out there knew Blanche McSmith, but maybe not more. But I saw public history knowledge having seeped out in a way in front of me that they recognized Blanche McSmith, and that it felt very validating for just history in general, for community engaged history. I think it was the museum exhibits that did it, the museum exhibit.
Yeah, no, thank you both. And I'll just say, just to maybe a personal disclaimer and note, the work that I've done on the exhibit, of course, has led me to befriend Julie, and that has been certainly one of the best things to come out of it for me. Just speaking in purely personal terms, I was fortunate enough to be friends and colleagues of David and Aaron ahead of time, but working with Julie on this exhibit has just been incredibly enriching, and I do want to recognize that for everybody. I don't have anything else to say or any questions to pose, and I don't know if I do not see any more in the chat. Marcia, I don't know if you wanted to jump on and say a few final words, or if we even wanted to give our panelists the opportunity to say maybe a final word or two. But I'll certainly say, just by way of concluding, that I've greatly appreciated talking to the three of you and thinking about public history and community engagement. And I think right now, in part because of what I've mentioned before, and Aaron, of course, brought up as well. I mean, with just in reference to Cook and this era of controversy that we live in, and David made references, as did Julie. We there's really, it's so important for us to weigh in as experts in the field, and as historians who have some research chops and who have something of the 40,000-foot view of how to put context together with narrative. What we do is very quite important. And what you're seeing here on this panel are three people who are really approaching public history from the perspective of rigor, from analysis, and from just all around, I think, a real deep commitment to the ideals of democracy. And so I do want to thank the three panelists, and turn things over to Marcia, if you have anything else you'd like to add.
I just want to thank all of the panelists and Ian as well for putting this together. This was so interesting. I was sitting like with my face right against the computer listening to you all the whole time. Thank you. This was our first event from Democracy and Civic Action Week 2021. We have several more events. Anyone who is interested, I can put the link in the chat here in just a moment for the rest of the events. This week, we have a debate going on tomorrow, hosted by Seawolf Debate on Tuesday at 7 p.m. And the proposition is all U.S. citizens should be required to perform 1 year of community or military service between the ages of 18 and 22. So, so that's the topic for our debate next week or tomorrow for anyone interested. Thank you all once again for being here. Thanks to the attendees and the host and the panelists. If anyone has any last words, you're welcome to share. Otherwise, I will say good night to everyone. Everyone's good. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.